Good afternoon, everybody. It's 3 o'clock and it's time to get our program running today. I'm Laura Polari-Welbus. I'm with Encore Learning, and I'm pleased to present to you our program with Karl VanNewkirk talking about Indigenous Peoples, Americas to Arlington, Virginia. Let Louise Kenny take over the program. Louise Kenny is a member of our Special Events Committee, and she's going to introduce our speaker today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura. You know, we have so many interesting speakers and interesting topics all through the year. And we love it when we have a particularly effective speaker and an important topic at the right time of the year. And that's what we have today. So I'm thrilled to be introducing to you Karl VanNewkirk. Many of you know Karl. He was in the original member of Encore Learning. He has taught courses about Arlington through Encore Learning for about 19 years, we figured out. He's also very, very knowledgeable about the history of Arlington. He served 3 different terms as the president of the Arlington Historical Society, and he just stepped down as a director of the society. He is also on the board of the Arlington Black Heritage Museum. And he was as a volunteer at the Historical Museum, and then he is also involved with Gunston Hall and their archaeology department there. So he's certainly knowledgeable about this topic. It's all about Indigenous peoples from a broader American perspective and into Arlington. And again, the timing couldn't be better because October 10th is Indigenous People Day, formerly Columbus Day, but Indigenous People Day now. So we're thrilled. We've been looking for somebody knowledgeable about this topic, and we hit the jackpot this time. So Karl, welcome, and it's yours.
Well, first, I'd like to thank you for inviting me here, and we'll see what happens. So there we go. When we're talking about prehistoric anything, we're talking about before history, meaning before things were written down. And of course, in this case, the big questions are, who was here before the Europeans arrived? Where did they come from? And what were they like? And I'll attempt to try to get to those questions. The first thing is the classical view, which we probably all learned in school. Some 13,500 years ago, sea levels were lower. There was a land bridge between Asia and America. People came across the land bridge. They walked through a ice-free corridor between 2 glaciers that were located in Alaska and came down from there and populated all of America. And these people were also known as the Clovis people. And this is the classical theory that has been taught, and so I'll go on from there. I said Clovis. What does Clovis mean? Clovis people, it refers to, or gets its name from, the town of Clovis, New Mexico, where back in the 1920s, the first Clovis Point was found and named for the archaeological dig where it was found. This is a projectile point. This is 3 versions of 3 pictures of the same Clovis Point, front, back, and side. This particular one was found in Iowa. Clovis points have been found over all of North America. They have a particular method of chipping the point to make it. And so the technology to create this existed all over North America, and some actually into the Caribbean, and I believe at least one point has been found in Venezuela. Clovis people were here locally. A Clovis point has been found in Alexandria. But there's been multiple discussions over the validity of this theory that I just related. A combination of sites that have been found that have been reliably dated to older than when the theory said that people came here, the realization that the corridor between two glaciers, the so-called ice-free corridor, was also a food-free corridor and several hundred miles long, and people wouldn't walk through an area where there was nothing to eat. And so a number of other theories have arisen in the last 20 or 30 years. This map shows the idea that there may have been 3 different comings to America, spread out geographically at different points in time. And this next map shows maybe even coming across the Atlantic with a route coming from Asia and another route coming via sea. And so I can't tell you what the mechanism, the actual mechanism was. I can tell you that there are a lot of theories. The main thing to take away is that the idea that Clovis people were first and they came across and went through that ice-free corridor, we're pretty sure that that idea is wrong. But what is right, or there's some combination of these ideas that is actually right, that remains to be seen. Stay tuned, and it will be elucidated at some future point. Well, archaeologists in particular have divided the Indian culture into 3 major periods. The Paleo Indians, covering the period from whenever history or prehistory starts to about 8,000 BCE, that's before the Common Era, what we used to call BC. The Archaic period for the next 7,000 years after that, and the Woodland Indians for the last 3,000 years worth of history. And it's a little bit confusing because if you look up the words paleo and archaic in the dictionary, you'll find that they mean the same thing. But we'll get there. Okay, let's talk about the Paleo Indians. What were the Paleo Indians like, the earliest version? Well, in the time of the Paleo Indians were here, because it was the Ice Age, the climate and vegetation of North America was much more like that in Canada than what we have today. Furthermore, because so much water was locked up in the glaciers, the sea level was much lower. I've seen estimates of between 140 and 300 feet lower than what it is now. And that contributes to the problem of figuring out when the early people came. If they came particularly by water and camped along the shore, all those campsites that they made are now underwater. And another characteristic of the Paleo Indians world is the megafauna, the large animals, the mammoths, the mastodons, the giant beavers, the cave bears, and so on, that were populating the world at the time, and the people had to deal with those animals. And there's also the suspicion that Clovis points were made in an effort to actually deal with those. Some Clovis points have been found in conjunction with mammoth bones. So we are pretty sure that they were hunted, the megafauna was hunted, and they were hunted with the Clovis points, and you know, all things go together there. The Paleo Indians were hunter-gatherers. They lived, we believe, in small family groups that moved around a lot. They did not have settled villages. They followed the animals where they went. They gathered vegetable matter, you know, fruits and nuts as they went. They did wear clothing. There is evidence that they had needles made of bone and that they could actually sew clothing. They did not live in caves, or at least not always and routinely. They weren't cavemen per se. As I said, they had fiber to do things like make clothes and to fasten points to the shafts, and do other things. To put things together, they certainly had fiber. They had fire. Many hearths have been found, and this is a source of dating, the carbon-14 dating of the charcoal. And they probably had atlatls. An atlatl is what the picture shows here. It's a spear thrower. And it's a stick that looks like this. And then the spear fits into it. And this atlatl greatly increases the power of the spear throwing. And we are pretty confident that they did have these, because this piece right here of the atlatl is a stone that adds weight and balance to the whole thing. And although the atlatl itself has not been found, the stones for them have been found. And so that tells us what's going on. The Paleo Indians did not have bows and arrows. They did have spears. The question is, one question is, were they thrusting spears or throwing spears? And I think the answer is probably a little of each. Hold the spear, the shaft of the spear in your hand and thrust it to gain more power, or to use an atlatl to throw it. Paleo Indians did not have any agriculture. They did not have any domesticated plants. And as best we know, they were very light on domesticated animals. There's a possibility, or maybe even a probability, that they did have domesticated dogs, but probably only in the, or I should say, after the second wave of immigration into America, because the dog fossils that we have found are all newer than the oldest remnants of the Paleo people. And that brings us to the second period of Indian culture, the Archaic Indians, starting about 8,000 years ago, excuse me, about 10,000 years ago, 8,000 BCE. And their culture was pretty similar to that of the Paleo Indians, except that by now the ice ages were over, the climate was changing, the sea level was rising, and so over an extended period of time, several thousand years, the climate was evolving from being like Canada to eventually being temperate the way that we have it now. And the biggest difference between the Paleo period and the Archaic period is that the megafauna were now extinct. Why did the megafauna go extinct? We're not particularly sure. There have been several theories put forth. Climate change might have had something to do with it. There may have been a meteor strike that wiped out some of these. And also the theory that the Paleo people hunted them to death, or maybe a combination of more than one of these causes. But anyway, the major difference between the Paleo people and the Archaic people was that their world did not have the megafauna in it. And the Archaic Indians also relied more than the Paleo people did on fish and shellfish. We can see that in the frequency with which fish bones and seashells are found in their trash heaps. The Archaic people probably were more numerous than the Paleo people and went around in larger groups, but they were still following the prey around and being gathering the fruits and nuts and whatnot from what grew wild. Towards the end of the Archaic period, they also learned how to make soapstone bowls. Soapstone is a soft stone that can be carved. It gets its name because if you rub your hand across it, it feels a little greasy, as though it's soapy. And we know that there was a deposit of soapstone that exists today in the District of Columbia, and it was mined at some point in the past And so it may well have been mined here locally. And we know that Archaic Indians also visited here locally. There have been campsites of Archaic Indians found in Arlington. I know of one that's in Potomac Overlook Park, and there are others that I don't know much about, but archaic tools and artifacts have been found at various places in the local area. And so, yes, archaic people were here, but if you remember that they were hunter-gatherers, they were passing through, they were not living here, they were visiting here, they were passing through, they left traces behind, but the Archaic period also extended for, I think I said 7,000 years. That's a long time for a lot of people to pass through and leave traces behind. And that brings us to the Woodland period, which is a little more interesting, the last 1,000 years. And the Woodland period is when the local people, or I should say the original inhabitants of North America, changed from being hunter-gatherers to being settled agriculturalists. So they were growing food. As growing food, they had to stay in one place for a more extended period of time. You have to clear the land, you have to plant the seeds, you have to tend the seedlings as they grow, and you have to harvest them in the fall. And then you hope that there was enough crop that was gathered that you can store it and eat it all winter. Agriculture also implies that your food supply is more regular and a greater number of calories. This leads to growth in the population. You know, more people survive. As the population grows, you can divide into villages or larger groups. As you get enough food that you do not, a single individual does not have to spend virtually all his working or his waking hours hunting food. There is time for other things to be done, such as you can have a chieftain who doesn't have to work. He does administrative things like running the tribe. You can have a priest who does religious things. You can have an artist who does artistic things. You can have a much greater culture if there is an excess of food that can support people who don't have to, you know, so-called work for a living kind of thing. And during the Woodland period, there was also a greater growth in the technology. And one of the first things that happened was the invention of ceramics. Ceramics is a technology that exists and has been invented at various places around the world multiple times. And it was invented here in America. On the right, you can see a picture of what a bowl or a bowl, I guess what you'd call it, or a cooking pot might have looked like. And on the left, you see an actual artifact. Actually, it's more than one artifact. It's a large number of artifacts that have been glued back together to form a piece of the original bowl that they broke off from. And this artifact on the left is called Marcy Creek pottery. Marcy Creek pottery, it means a particular style of manufacture and technique of manufacture and style of decoration. And it was first described in the archaeological literature by a man who did the excavation at Marcy Creek, which is in Arlington. It's a small creek a little bit north of Spout Run. And that's where it was found first and described in the literature. It has subsequently been found, Marcy Creek pottery has been found all over the Chesapeake Bay region, including on the eastern shore. We don't know where it was first invented, but we do know where it was first found, right here. Somewhere around 1500 years ago, we know that there was contact between the Chesapeake region and the Ohio River Valley area of North America, because similar artifacts were found in both places. We don't know whether this means that people from Ohio came to the Chesapeake, or people from the Chesapeake went to Ohio, or whether there was trade back and forth. But we do know there was contact. Somewhere around 1500 years ago, true agriculture came. Prior to that, agriculture consisted of encouraging the right kind of plants to grow, but true agriculture means that they were deliberately planting and deliberately growing things. And we found the remnants of squash and beans and tobacco making up that original set of agricultural items. And then around 1000, around the year 1000, or 500 years or so, 600 years before the Europeans arrived, was when bows and arrows were invented. They were invented other places in the old world earlier, but here in this part of North America, they were relatively recent. And this was also the time when maize began to be cultivated, or native corn. Corn came out of Mexico, and eventually the techniques of cultivating corn made it to the eastern part of North America. And this was also the time frame, or the approximate time frame, when the Algonquins arrived in our local area. Well, that raises the question, who were the Algonquins? The Algonquins were a linguistically and culturally related group of Native Americans. Their range is depicted here in brown. They probably came to our area from the St. Lawrence River area, but in particular, draw your attention to this area right in here, Algonquian population. They lived along the seacoast, but here you see that the Europeans, the Englishmen who came to America and wrote down what they saw in Massachusetts starting in 1620, the Indians they encountered were Algonquians. The same thing is true for the Englishmen who came and settled in Jamestown starting in 1607. The Indians that they encountered were Algonquians. And the same thing is true for the Englishmen who came to North Carolina in 1585 and tried to establish a colony, which wasn't very successful, but the Indians that they encountered were Algonquians. And there were similarities between the culture, the ways of life of all of these, such that we can look at what was written about any of these groups and say it applies to the groups that we're particularly interested in, namely those who lived in Virginia or Arlington. And the first historic mention we have of the Arlington Indians is shown on this map. The colony of Jamestown was established in 1607. The following year, John Smith went on a voyage of exploration in a small boat with a small number of people, and he went from Jamestown up the Chesapeake Bay and up all the major tributaries of the Chesapeake Bay as far as he could go, and took notes on everything he found. And this map was created about 1611, after a few years after his trip, based on the notes that he took. It looks a little peculiar because the map is drawn from the perspective of a mariner coming to the New World from Europe. So coming towards the west, and the north is in this direction over here, and the Chesapeake Bay is here. Jamestown is on the James River down here. But if you look, this is the Potomac River. And he went up the Potomac River. This area right in here is where we live. And now let's zoom in a little bit on that. And this is a magnification of that particular portion of the Potomac River. Here's the river. Here's the area where we live. Here is the symbol for a native village. Here is the name of that village, and I'll mispronounce it, but it seems to be Namurakend, which translates approximately a good fishing place. That village was located, as best we can figure out, approximately where the Pentagon is today. And you'll see here on the other side of the river is a larger symbol. This is the symbol that was used on the map for the King's Village, or where the chief of the local tribe lived. Here's the name of that village, Nacotchtank, on the opposite side of the river, approximately where Bolling Air Force Base is now. And that name of that village gives us the name of the Indian tribe that lived in the area, the Nacotchtank. And that Nacotchtank name was anglicized to Nacostan and then Latinized to Anacostan or Anacostia, and still continues in common use today, Anacostia. We see some other villages in the area. Here's another village right here, probably was a Nacotchtank village. Here's another village over here. Name of this village is Asiomek. That seems to be located on the southern side of Great Hunting Creek, which is the large creek that's at the south side of Old Town Alexandria. And so Asiomek and Namurakend and Nacotchtank, we believe, were all Nacotchtank villages, and probably this one as well, which Smith didn't get the name of. Then there are a couple of other villages that are of particular note. Over here is Moyance, and that was the home of the Piscataway. It's an alternate name for that village. Here's the chief's village of Moyance, and you may have heard of the Powhatan Indians that lived around Jamestown, where Powhatan was a supreme chief that had sort of suzerainty over a number of tribes. I believe that, and most ethnographers believe, but not universally, that the Piscataway, headquartered at Moyance, had similar suzerainty over several tribes in this area, including the Nacotchtank. So this was the big boss, and this was the little boss. And then we have Namasinkoit, which probably was a Piscataway village, but maybe it was a Nacotchtank village. We're not 100% sure. And the little further south, we have the village of Tuxinant. Down here, this right here is Mason Neck, so this is along the Occoquan. And Tuxinant was another chief's village, and alternately called the Dogue, and that's the way it's come down to us. There's a Dogue Creek in that vicinity now, and the Dogue were probably also subordinate to the Piscataway, but we don't know for sure. So those were the local lineup. And then there are other Indians that sometimes came in this area that are not shown on this map. In particular, let's see, the Monacans and the Susquehannocks, and they were Iroquois Indians, ethnically different. They lived further inland. They came down from the north from time to time on hunting parties and sometimes raiding parties. And so there was occasional warfare between the Nacotchtank and the Iroquois Indians. I talked about these villages. Well, what were these villages like? Well, this is a picture created by the National Park Service of what such a village might have looked like. You'll notice that there are huts or houses. They were made with poles or saplings that were bent over to form an arch and then covered with mats of bark or reeds to create houses. You see that there were agricultural fields in the background, and here's a larger village or a larger house that probably was the chief's house or a storehouse or maybe both. It looks almost like a two-story house, and it's possible that some of these houses were tall enough to be to have a second story, so to speak, in them. You'll notice that it's along the river, and here's a collection of dugout canoes available for the Indians to travel or to go fishing from. This was a prime thing that they did. But anyway, this is what such a village might have looked like, and it would be true for all of the villages that I mentioned earlier. Well, what did the Indians themselves look like? Here are some pictures. Now, these pictures were taken from a book, and the pictures themselves are, the story of the pictures is almost as fascinating as the story of the Indians. I mentioned the English going into North Carolina in 1585. That was the an expedition to establish a colony in North Carolina. That was the Sir Richard Grenville colony. Richard Grenville, Sir Richard was a cousin to Sir Walter Raleigh, and he was the one who was trying to establish the village, or the colony, I should say. The people went in 1585 on the inner side of the Outer Banks of North Carolina. They lived there for about a year. At that point, they decided they couldn't make it, and they went back to England. But among the colonists was a man named John White and another man named Thomas Harriot. John White was an artist, and he drew watercolor pictures of lots of things that he saw, and those pictures are still in the British Museum. Thomas Harriot was a scientist. He took lots of notes on everything that he observed. After the Grenville colony went back to England, Sir Richard decided he would try again, and a year later he sent another colony. This time John White was the leader of the colony, and they went back to approximately the same place in North Carolina, and this colony was the one that ended up being called the Lost Colony. They disappeared, and no traces of what happened to them have been found. John White survived because he had gone back to England before the colony disappeared. But in a few years later, in 1591, John White's pictures, the watercolors, were turned into engravings by a Dutch engraver named Theodore de Bry. And Thomas Harriot's notes and Theodore de Bry's engravings were turned into a book, the Brief and True Account of the Newfound Land of Virginia. It was published simultaneously in English, French, German, and Latin. And these pictures that I'm showing you now, and I will show you several additional pictures, are the engravings that were published as part of that book in the back part of the book. And those pictures, or John White's watercolors that were the basis for those pictures, have been widely reproduced as pictures of early Indians. And of course, because these were Algonquin Indians, they are applicable to our local tribe. Now, these pictures are detailed enough. Here's some things that you can particularly notice. He's wearing a feather on top of his head as part of his headdress. And we know that gnats that like to fly around your head. Gnats tend to fly around the highest part of your body. And so wearing a feather on your head gets the gnats to fly a little bit above your head and therefore create less of a problem for you. You can still do this trick today when you're walking in the woods. Over here, we see that his clothing includes the tail of the animal that created the skin. And that tail is shown in enough detail that we can identify the animal that it came from. That's the woods bison. It's a variant of the American bison that lived east of the Mississippi and went extinct before the rest of the bison did. And of course, the rest of the bison survived by the skin of their teeth, but the woods bison went extinct. You can see over here some jewelry that he's wearing. The Indians did not have metal, with the exception of a little bit of copper. And this bracelet may have been made out of copper. They did not know how to smelt metal. They did not use copper to make tools, but they did use, but copper sometimes occurs in the form of nuggets of almost pure copper, and it can be beaten by, rock tools and made into jewelry. And so the Indians did indeed make jewelry out of copper. And here you see some of that. The Indians also decorated their bodies with tattoos, and you can see some of that here, for example. And they did the tattooing by pricking the skin and then rubbing something, perhaps ashes, into the cuts and creating designs on their skin. So we know something about their way of life, that we can interpret from these pictures. Here's a picture of the ladies and their dress, a little bit different. Again, showing tattoo decoration. This would be what they would wear in the summertime. You see that they're lightly dressed to deal with the heat. And the observation was made that they like to walk along the shore and observe the people fishing. And there you see what they're doing. Here you see them cooking. And this is, I showed you earlier, a picture of a pot that was originally a John White drawing. This is a Theodore DeBry engraving of that same pot cooking over a fire, and them creating, and the English in the description of this were a little bit marveling at the way that the Indians threw water and vegetables and meat and fish all in the same pot and made a kind of a stew. Apparently they were not familiar, the English were not familiar with stews, but they referred to it by the Spanish name olla podrida, or the French name gallimaufry, but not by an English name. And interestingly, if you look in here, you can see the details. There's an ear of corn, and here's a fish that's in there with the rest of the material that's in the pot. So there's a lot of detail that can be found. This was a topic that the English really marveled at, how to make a canoe. And particularly since the Indians did not have many metal tools, how could you do all of this carving? Well, they went into great length to describe how here is the tree being felled without the use of an axe. Put a fire around the base of the tree and let it burn until it's almost burnt through, and then you can push the tree over. Over here is how the limbs were taken off of the tree. You see a small fire here burning off the limbs of the tree, Another one over here burning off other limbs to get the trunk of the tree. And we know also that tulip poplars were a favorite tree to make canoes out of, because the tulip poplar tends to have a large, long, straight trunk. So it is good for that. Then they take after the outer limbs are burnt off, or the limbs are burnt off, then they can take the whole trunk and do a series of controlled burns, set fire to the interior of the trunk, control the fire by putting wet mud on the sides of the fire so that it only burns the part that you want it to. Here's the man fanning the flames of where it was intended to burn. And then once the burning has gone as far as you want it to, put the fire out and scrape the charcoal out with a shell, and then repeat the process and keep on going bit by bit by bit, taking several weeks to create the whole canoe. And these canoes would end up being large enough to hold sometimes as many as 40 men in one canoe, although that would be an unusual one. You saw the size of the canoes gathered on the bank below the village, and the canoes were of a size to hold 3 to 5, which might be a more common size for a canoe. Here you see the picture of them fishing, and this is a composite picture. It shows a number of different ways of fishing. Out here are men in waist-deep water with spears and spearing the fish that are here in the water between a net, a weir that's here, and another one that's over here. So the fish have been caught in this enclosed area, and the spear fishing by waders. It's interesting that this weir is shown sort of backwards. The weir typically is done so that the fish are swimming on this side of the weir are directed by this net into this enclosed weir here, and that's how they're caught. Here you see another form of fishing. This one, there is a fire in the canoe, and that would be for night fishing, because the English reported that they put the fire in the boat to dazzle the eyes of the fish, and then they could spear it from there. The English also made a note that the spear point for fishing was made from the tail of a certain crab. And here you see those certain crabs. And this was kind of interesting to the English, because these are horseshoe crabs. And horseshoe crabs are not native to Europe. So this was a brand new animal that the English had never seen before. But the tail of a horseshoe crab is indeed a pointy kind of, it's got a shell on it. And it would make a good point for a reed that could be used as a fish spear. And here in the water, you also see pictures of other kinds of fish and aquatic creatures that the Indians would hunt. And in the body of the book, there are lists of the numbers of different kinds of fish and seafood, sea fish, or shellfish that the Indians used as part of their diet. This is a picture of the Indians' god. This is an idol of the god Kiwasa, or sometimes spelled Okius. I'm not sure how it was pronounced. This was an idol. He had his own little temple, and Okius was a severe god. Okius If he didn't like what you were doing, he could cause your crops to fail. He could cause you to become sick. He could cause your wife to become unfaithful to you. And so Okius needed to be propitiated at regular intervals, or perhaps even more often than that. And little altars were built to Okius wherever they felt the need to do so, perhaps out in the woods, but also in the village, there might be a special temple to Okius. And this is an interesting picture too. This is a mortuary. You see, this was a special hut. It's a 2-story hut that I spoke about. And inside here are the dead bodies. Now, these weren't just ordinary dead bodies, but the English went into some level of description about how they treated their dead. First, they laid the body out and then stripped the skin off the body, removed all of the flesh, put the skin back on to the bones, and then put the collection of bones and skin into this mortuary to go through an extended period of drying and might last several years. So here's what you see there. Over here is another idol to Okius, who is supervising the process. And down here is a priest who is tending to this and keeping all of these remains, in order and not to be disturbed, and so on. At the end of an extended period, several years, these might be gathered up, placed in individual bags, and then actually buried. And necropolises have been found with the remains of multiple individuals all buried. I believe there was one found where the runway at Bolling Air Force Base is now. So yeah, they did this locally. This picture, of course, was made in North Carolina. Well, I said that the Indians, the Nacotchtank, were a branch of the Piscataway. What happened to the Piscataway? Once upon a time, the Piscataway were believed to number about 2,500 people. Well, due to a variety of circumstances, including the English taking the Indians' land and warfare and disease, by 1697 or thereabouts, and all these dates are approximate, the Piscataway abandoned their villages and went into the backwoods and up to an island in the Potomac called Heater's Island. Presumably, when I say the Piscataway, the Nacotchtank, if there were any of them left, they were part of that group that left the local area and went up to Heater's Island. And by this time, there were only about 400 of them left in total. In 1704, there's a record that there was a smallpox epidemic, which did a pretty good number on the Piscataway in general. In the early 18th century, the Piscataway moved from Heater's Island up to the central Pennsylvania. And by this time, they had entered into an agreement with the Iroquois Indians who lived in central Pennsylvania, that they would ally with them or accept their protection or something along this line. The Iroquois name for the Piscataway was Conoy, and so the name Conoy is the name that they went by for their further existence. And Heater's Island also got the name Conoy Island, and perhaps they were named Conoy prior to their departure from Conoy Island, or from Heater's Island. It's not clear. Also in this grouping in central Pennsylvania was another Algonquian tribe, the Nanticoke, And so the Nanticoke and the Piscataway kind of traveled together across for their future travels, but we'll keep on going with that under the protection of the Iroquois Indians. So by the mid 1800s, they were in southern New York State, in the region where Binghamton is now, but now their total strength of the Piscataway was about 120. By the late 1700s, late 18th century, the Piscataway were part of the Western Indian Confederacy, and their strength was down to about 50. The Western Indian Confederacy was a large grouping of Indians that gathered in the northwestern Ohio, and they were involved in trying to negotiate with the representatives of the United States. The Indians wanted to live under the conditions of the treaty that had been previously negotiated with the British, which allocated the land north and west of the Ohio River to Indians and said that white people would not go there. The US government in the negotiations said that subsequent events such as the Revolution and the treaty with the British, between the British and the Americans, had superseded the old treaty between the British and the Indians, and therefore the Americans wanted white people to settle in Ohio, which the Indians didn't want. The negotiations between the Western Indian Confederacy and the commissioners representing the United States government were done by correspondence. So one side would write up something or other and send it off, and then days or weeks later, a counter proposal would come back, kind of thing. We know that the Piscataway or the Kanoi were part of that because two of those proposals, whatever you want to call them, to the American commissioners were indeed signed by the Kanoi with their mark, that of a turkey. The negotiations ended up failing. And so the American army then attacked the Indians and soundly defeated them at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, which was in 1794. A large number of Indians were killed. There was a treaty written at Greenville in 1795, which sort of settled up after the Indians had lost. Although there were 3 Turkey signatures on the Treaty of Greenville, but they were not identified as Kanoi. And so it's not clear whether the Kanoi signed the Treaty of Greenville or not, whether they were, several other tribes used the turkey symbol as well. But in any event, the communications from the Western Indian Confederacy in 1793 to the American commissioners are the last known firm evidence of the Kanoi Indians in the historical record. And so the historical consensus has been that this marked the end of the Kanoi, the Piscataway. There were no more. But not true. In the 20th century, a man named Philip Proctor came to prominence. He was somewhat of an activist and an agitator, and he claimed that no, all of the Piscataway did not go north and west when the bulk of them did. Some of them stayed behind in southern Maryland and retreated to the swamps and the backwoods. Presumably they were joined there by runaway slaves and perhaps by marginalized whites who lived on the fringes of society and didn't take much participation in the larger historical record and were pretty much ignored by everybody. But according to Philip Proctor, they continued to live there and have survived down into the 20th century. Furthermore, Philip Proctor said that the Piscataway word for chief was Tayak, and he was descended from the last Tayak of the Piscataway, and that the Piscataway took the turkey as their symbol, and therefore he wanted to be known as Turkey Tayak, and that was the name that he went by. And he kept agitating for the fact that the Piscataway still existed in the form of this remnant population. And it turned out in the course of all of this that there was also some oral history that hadn't been recognized before, that after the Battle of Fallen Timbers, there were some survivors of the battle who made their way back to their ancestral homeland in central Maryland. This is particularly surprising to me because if you look at the dates, the people that might have done that would have been the grandchildren of the last Piscataway to have actually seen their ancestral homeland. But, you know, you can't argue with oral history. It is what it is. Anyway, Philip Proctor, or excuse me, Turkey Tayak, was eventually successful in getting the state of Maryland to recognize the Piscataway Indian Nation and also the Piscataway Kanoy tribe. He was not successful in getting the state of Virginia or the federal government to recognize either of these entities, but both of them are currently recognized by the state of Maryland. And so Piscataway still exists. And that is about what I wanted to say. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
So I was going to transition this back to Laura, who will talk about the upcoming events.
Great. Thank you so much, Louise. And thank you, Karl. What a wonderful presentation. If you like this, there's more to come because upcoming for Encore Learning on Thursday, September 1st, we have our fall course preview. It's at 10 a.m. on Zoom. And then on Tuesday, September 6th, we have our course registration for the fall. You can sign up for one of 37 courses. And we also have our 20th anniversary celebration coming up. It's on September 12th, and it's live in person at George Mason University. And we do ask that you register for that event by Friday, August 26th. That's this Friday. Now, if you want to hear another program on a Monday afternoon, it's our Encore Learning Presents programs. And next one is on Monday, September 26th. It's at 3 o'clock. It's at the same Zoom link that you used today. And it's entitled The Wonders of City Wandering. And it's with Didier Rousselet, who will come back virtually from Paris to our region with this fascinating stories that will be in an upcoming book on the beauty of cities. So please put that on your calendar. The next Monday, 3 o'clock event is Monday, September 26th. And then after you leave the webinar on your browser, you will have a optional survey pop up in SurveyMonkey. And we appreciate if you can take the time to give us feedback. And it takes just a moment. So that will show up in your browser when the webinar concludes. So thank you so much.
Laura, can I say something?
Yes.
Looking at what you just said there, Monday is not the 1st of September.
Yes, it is. It's Thursday, September 1st is the course preview. Thank you so much for clarifying that.
Great. Laura, thank you. So Karl, there are a few questions that have been posed that I would like to feed to you for comments. The first one actually has to do with what I said in the introduction about Indigenous Peoples Day. And somebody asked, is that official? And did it replace Columbus Day? So I did a quick search, and it is official. President Biden last year made what has formerly been, or currently really too, a Columbus Day, and designated as Indigenous Peoples Day. But it's not official that all states have to follow that. So I saw a listing of about 17 states that have made that transition to Indigenous Peoples Day versus Columbus Day. Do you have any other insight on that, Karl?
I do not. I just looked at a calendar that I have, and it was published sometime in the summer of last year.
Correct.
But it still says Columbus Day.
Yeah, it does. And I think the country's got to divide it on who's staying with Columbus Day and who's doing Indigenous Peoples Day. So, but it was elevated to that status by President Biden last year. So, a number of times you talked about Indigenous people being called Indians. For example, the Paleo Indians and the Clovis and Archaic peoples Indians. So, how did the term Indians come about that early?
Well, it didn't. The people, neither the Clovis people nor the Paleo Indians nor the Archaic Indians used the word Indians. That's an English word. And it was given, my understanding is that when Columbus arrived here, he thought he was in the Indies in India, and that's where the name came from, and it stuck. And we have to deal with it ever since. It's
Okay.
not correct, but there it is. It's the
Okay.
it's the word that everyone knows.
Okay. You mentioned the bracelets that were on the figures in the drawings. Powell Hutton asked the question: wouldn't those wide bracelets shown on the right wrist of the men also be guards to protect the wrist against the release of the bowstring?
Could well have been. Could well have been. There is an explanatory text in the book that talks about each of those pictures, but it doesn't mention the particular purpose like that but it does mention that they have the bracelets.
Based on the pictures, the men have short or no hair. Without metal tools, what is the speculation on how they shave their heads? Any knowledge on that?
Probably sharp seashells, or even plucking the hair out to remove it entirely. Native Americans in general are less hairy than Europeans, so they had a little bit of an easier job of it.
Okay.
But
was that an accepted practice, do you know, among the indigenous peoples?
I think that varied from tribe to tribe.
Okay. You talked about the trees and hollowing out the trees for the canoes. How was the tree cut lengthwise, in half lengthwise, given the system with fires?
Good question. It wasn't mentioned in the text. I know that at Gulf Branch Nature Center and also at Potomac Overlook Park, the naturalists have tried to recreate the process of making a canoe. But I don't know what they did to cut the log in half. I suspect that it was probably burnt down, which didn't show in the picture. But the Indians had stone tools, but a stone axe is not very efficient at cutting wood. It's more like a club than an axe.
Mm-hmm. So the theory is what? That
well,
or is
we
there
in
one?
the 21st century have a hard time thinking about how to make things without any of the tools that we're used to.
Yeah. So
and anything that we would try, we would be doing it for the first time But the Native Americans were doing it based on instructions from their parents or the people who had done it before. And so they were much more skilled at it than we would be.
So Lark asks us to mention that there are log canoe races at St. Michael's. In fact, Karl, have you been to any of those?
I have not been to them, no.
Okay. So if anybody's particularly interested in that, so thing coming up. Who kept the numbers of the Kanoi as they were declining?
From time to time, someone would visit a village. And sometimes the visitor would count the huts, and sometimes the visitor would count the warriors, and sometimes the visitor would count all the people. And then later historians come and try to extrapolate from the record that was kept as to how many were actually there in the population. But no, official censuses were not taken, but those are all estimates based on things like that.
Okay. How did the many various groups of Algonquins get separated?
Well, I don't know any detailed specifics, but I would say that there were thousands of people that were Algonquins. They were in groupings of friends and relatives, clearly. They were close enough to each other that that their languages were close. When John Smith traveled throughout the Chesapeake, he acted as his own interpreter based on what he had learned from studying the records that came back from North Carolina, plus what he had learned in place in 6 months at Jamestown. But how did they, if you get several, say 2,000 people, they'll naturally congregate into smaller groups by themselves. And 2,000, they didn't have cities, they didn't have any kind of infrastructure to cover more than, say, 1 to 100, 150, 200 people at the most in a particular village. You're talking about a grouping of people that doesn't have a water supply, that doesn't have a sewage system, that has to have their homes interspersed with their agricultural fields. There's a limit to how big a village can be.
So it was really a natural evolution kind of process,
I'm
right?
sure it was, yes.
Yeah, okay. Another question by Steve Spangler. Turkey Kayak is in Maryland, St. Mary's County, yes? He asks where? Is
there a village named that? Turkey Kayak was the name that Philip Proctor adopted and wanted to be known as. And I believe he is deceased now, but he was active for a number of years, mostly in Southern Maryland, Prince George's County, and I guess St. Mary's County, but advocating for the existence of and the rights of the Piscataway people. He encountered resistance from the white population, I think mostly because they were afraid that if they recognized him as an Indian or recognized his people as an Indian nation, they would open a casino, and they didn't want that. I believe part of the deal for recognizing them was an agreement by the Native Americans that they would not open a casino if they were recognized.
This next question is about you, Karl. It says, would you do another class focusing on the indigenous peoples of Virginia, some of whom recently want to fight to be recognized? So is that on your bucket list to do another class about this?
Well, it hasn't been. My bucket list keeps changing, but I guess you're talking about those Indians that live further south than Arlington. And yeah, I was interested in concentrating on Arlington.
Okay.
The recognition of Indians in Virginia is very tough because there was a man named Walter Plecker who was the chief of statistics in Virginia in the 1920s and earlier, I guess. And he insisted that there were only two kinds of people, white and black. And if you think about that, that means there were no Indians. So the official records of the state of Virginia show no Native Americans in Virginia during his tenure.
Oh, okay.
And that makes it hard to show continuity.
Yeah. And who was this again?
His name was Walter Plecker. He was infamous. He was basically he was an admirer of the Nazis' racial policies.
Oh, okay.
He was the instigator of the one-drop rule, or a strong advocate of the one-drop rule. He did some horrible things like going so far as to direct the exhumation of people who might be of the wrong racial composition in the graveyard, to direct them to be buried someplace else.
Okay.
It's an awful period in history, but there it is. That's what we have to live with.
Yeah. The book of drawings was quite interesting, and Peggy asked the question: are they available in libraries? Those books that you talked about.
You know, that I'm not sure. It's called A Brief and True Report of the Newfound Land of Virginia, and it was republished in when? Relatively recently, 1972. If you'd want it, I'd look on Amazon, see if you could get it.
Yeah.
I don't remember where I got it now, but I love it.
Yeah. Are Virginia's tribes closest to our area considered Algonquin?
If you remember that map that I showed, the Algonquians were on the coastal portions of all of Virginia. So the eastern shore, Delaware, Maryland on the eastern shore, the Virginia part that's close to the river, we're about as far inland as the Algonquians went. So further inland, there were other Indians that were not Algonquian.
Okay. You can see I'm not here. My husband's background here. Sorry about that.
The coastal plain was Algonquian territory. The Piedmont and the mountains was not.
Okay. Now you're saying Algonquian, and I had always heard the word Algonquin. Are they different tribes or different ways to pronounce it?
I think it's just different ways to pronounce it.
Okay.
They did not have a written language, so it came into English in several different ways.
Okay. Dean Kaufman asked the question: how do the engravings compare to the watercolors, and are there prints of these?
Well, the engravings that I'm most familiar with are the ones that are in the book. There were more engravings that were made, but you can see a definite relationship. If you remember the one picture that was in color of the cooking pot, that looked to me like, I'm pretty sure that was one of the watercolors. But then I showed you the picture of the Indians cooking, that was the engraving. So you can see that they were not identical, but you can see the relationship between them. The engraving, or the engravings were definitely based on the watercolors.
Gotcha. Question: do the Pamunkey and Mattapony Indians on Hampton Roads do they get any federal assistance for living expenses? This person visited there many years ago and they look pretty destitute. Plus,
that I do not know.
Okay.
But I'm pretty sure that they were all Algonquian and they were all part of the Powhatan Confederacy.
Okay. By the way, somebody commented that Arlington County has recognized Indigenous people in 2021 to replace Columbus Day. So that's the official local. And I think Alexandria did as well. I'm in Alexandria and I think they did as well. After the Piscataway left this area in Northern Virginia, what tribal groups remained?
Well, this was a period when the English were taking over everything, and the tribes found it impossible to live in their land because the English wanted it. So they were not replaced by Indians, they were replaced by Englishmen.
Gotcha. What is the Native American population in Arlington today? And if you don't know Arlington, Northern Virginia or Virginia, what is the status today generally?
I think you'd have to look at the census numbers, and those numbers should be publicly available. I have not looked at them, but the one thing that I notice about the census and the racial designations is that there's a different breakout of racial identification every census. So there's very little consistency from census to census. And furthermore, the latest census, I believe, allowed you to put more than one racial category for yourself, and the individual who put it in was allowed to put anything he wanted. So basically, you are whatever race you say you are.
Yeah. It's harder that way, doesn't it? It gets harder that way. The last question I think here is, John asked the question, where to see that book that you held up with the color pictures? The book with the color pictures. Is that in our library, in the Arlington Library, do you know?
Well, the book that I held up was this one.
Okay.
This is my personal possession. As I said, I read off the title, but if you were interested in it, either a library catalog or an Amazon search,
yeah.
The author that's listed on the title page is Thomas Harriot. He was the one that wrote the text for all of it.
Okay. Thomas Harriot. So
Harriot.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. I think we're pretty much. I think that's the end of the questions. Also, I should tell you that a number of people said, I don't have a specific question, but I love the presentation.
Oh, thank you.
So please feel good about that. And clearly, everybody really stayed right till the end. So that also is a sign that everybody was interested in it.
Thank you.
So Karl, thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. We hope to see you back in class in the next year or so.
Yeah, I have given that class on Arlington history to Encore Learning, as you said, for a number of years. And my intention on today is that I do it again next spring. We'll see what happens.
We'll see what happens, but good. That's a good sign. So also, I wanted to remind you all to take the survey at the end of this session here, because we appreciate getting your feedback, and Karl will appreciate getting your feedback as well. And finally, if you have any interest in helping us in the committee for special events, we'd love to have you. We think we're a fun group of people to work with. We certainly engage interesting speakers like Karl. So please do think about joining us and being part of the special events effort here. So with that, I will close this out. Thank you. Laura already told you things coming up. So keep your eye on those emails coming in and to keep track of what's going on. And please do come to our 20th anniversary. That's a big deal. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. Karl, thank you.
Thank you for having me.